I urge you to join me to look, to focus. More often than not, we do not see what most needs to be perceived. The campaigns I come up with forces people to look because we hold ourselves accountable when we see. We're held accountable when we're seen. So better yet, to be watched and held accountable. These particular campaigns were created for a Big Cats initiative. They were animated. These are the static iterations. There are 2 of 6 that I'm showing to you now. And they were all animated to blink and stare at people. People would walk into the room and see them and not know why they were so arrested by these big cats. Most don't notice, but the reason why I coined them this way was because people don't relate to animals that have different pupil proportions than we do. The cooperative eye hypothesis posits that we relate better instinctively, intuitively to animals or beings that have the same pupil proportions as us. Big cats don't. They might be seductive, they might be secretive and cryptic and sensual, but beyond Cartier, they don't resonate with us. And there's a reason for it. And so what I decided to do was embed human eye proportions into these big cats. And that's why they appeal to us. We're essentially highly narcissistic beings. I believe in investing in wild the way we do into corporations, into brands. And I see everything that I work with as a brand, whether it's a community, whether it's people, whether I'm working with wildlife ecosystems. They all bring unique services and are inimitable in what they have to offer. So their purpose is worth communicating. And that's when I bring in collaborations, such as both corporations as well as nonprofits, to indulge this nexus between having impact on the ground and finding a way to translate dollars in a meaningful manner through consumers into global change and coexistence. For me, each campaign that I iterate is a way for us to bring eyes on an issue in a single glimpse. Frankly, we live in a generation that is incredibly distracted. We have the attention span of a tsetse fly. And everything that we are communicated to needs to be within a single glimpse or within 140 characters or a Snapchat. And that is the millennials particularly. So when I'm trying to communicate really complex narratives, if they're not simplified into something that is obvious and quick to understand, it will just never reach the critical audience that needs to change its consumer behavior. When do I consider a campaign successful? A story is successful when it is assimilated by somebody else as their own narrative, as an extension of who they are and what they stand for. So for me, when I create something, it is not just to tell the story of the brand that I'm working for or for the species or the ecosystem that I'm trying to get protected tomorrow or day after. What I'm really trying to do is get people to understand that every single story that I'm saying to them is actually a part of who they are. So in a sense, they're recognizing the story within that comes to life in a moment of awareness that is made evident when they look at this particular image. Oftentimes, people internalize my work to the extent they're willing to tattoo their own body with it. I have not done that yet, but lo and behold. The most effective campaigns I've run have been really stark. And we ran these particular images across China in all of the major cities, on airports, on billboards, in shopping centers, on magazines. We tried to iterate it in as many ways as possible to the key demographic that was having the purchasing power to consume these products. And we had a market change in consumer behavior simply because this was the first time they were able to perceive the narrative. I try to tell the same story or the same narrative in multiple ways. In other occasions, I tell different narratives through the same communicative mechanism. So this was one where I was trying to challenge their perspective in China about these iconic animals in Africa that were being slaughtered. They're in fact the pandas of Africa. So if China can take pride in pandas, why not in African wildlife? So getting them to just shift from what is known by them to what is unknown, and bridging that gap, that cognitive dissonance within them. These are the campaigns that I created that iterate the same way, but for different species, so for different narratives. You're looking at elephants here, and they all say the same message. It's different species being consumed by the same market. And the 2 Chinese characters spell China and Chinese in the Zhonggu. For me, every time I create something, the thing I first look at is the plot. What is the plot? By which I mean, can we define the problem set? What is the gap that we're trying to bridge? What is the essence of the brand that we're trying to communicate? What is missing in the public understanding that we need to help them come into grips with? And when I talk about minding one's language, I think about bananas, because we often come to conclusions about labels. We say that one label has a sweeping definition that sells either good or bad. We live in a binary system that is a dichotomy. It is often not the case. Many companies manipulate this system. Many nonprofits manipulate this as well. And as consumers, we need to inform ourselves. For instance, when you look at bananas and you think about organic versus inorganic, what do you think is a more sustainable way to consume a banana, organic or inorganic? Most would say organic, because organic is the right way to go. But bananas as such are a highly homogenized, genetically homogenized crop, and they are not resilient. So when we're trying to cultivate them, we would have to clear fresh land every time we want to plant this crop. So we're clearing more rainforests to grow organic bananas, and our carbon and ecological footprint is far worse for an organic banana than it would ever be for an inorganic. So mind the language that you use, and most times we're using things like ethical fashion or green sustainability, all these terms, without really defining what we mean by that. And it's so subjective what each company, what each nonprofit means when they use those words. I always say state what's obvious, because when I've run massive campaigns that have had mass appeal, oftentimes the question that I get asked at the end of it is the most obvious question, which I would assume that they would know the answer to, and oftentimes they don't. For instance, I ran a campaign in Times Square against ivory. It was on a mass billboard, and I did a quantitative survey in Times Square to see what tourists or people who were looking at this billboard, what they were internalizing and what questions they left with. The number one question I got from that billboard was, what is ivory? So that was where I needed to start, and I hadn't explained that. I always say embed emotional triggers, because we're not rational creatures. Every single decision we come to, whether it's policy or in terms of daily decision-making as consumers, every time we pull the wallet out, it is an impulse purchase made by an emotional state. So always embed emotional triggers, because that's what makes us act. That enables us more than anything else. Now I'm going to take you to Africa. I wasn't always an explorer. I was actually in fashion before this, working at Ralph Lauren and other companies on 7th Avenue. So I have a marketing, branding background, and I decided one day to just throw everything up in the air and go save the world, which is sort of a pipe dream. But it kind of panned out for me, because I woke up one day and Nat Geo decided to get behind what I wanted to do, which is tell unique multimedia immersive stories such that it would touch people deeply and empower them to move from what they knew to what they could be doing as active participants, engaged citizens. This particular day, I woke up, I had no clue how to use my 1DX Canon camera. I was a novice. I didn't know what I was in for in Africa, because I'd only been on game safaris before that on vacation. And I was told by a couple of really well-known photographers to wake up bright and early, because that is the best light to capture wildlife. It's when wild is most active. And I'm not a morning person, so I hated that. But I woke up anyway at 4:30 when I heard all of this rustling outside my tent. I didn't know what I was going to be in for, but I ran out with my camera, not really checking my equipment, which I should have done, rookie mistake. But I ran out, and I saw this gorgeous giraffe towering over me, literally 4 feet in front of me. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is an out-of-Africa close encounter, walking amongst giants, instant in my life. It was just completely life-altering. But in my enthusiasm, I'd forgotten that I hadn't pulled my camera up to my face yet. So I stumble around and get my camera up, and it's all pitch black. I figure, OK, maybe I forgot to take my lens cap off, and so I'm searching around for it, but I have to search really far ahead. And that's when it strikes me, I'm up the giraffe's nostril, because I was with a telephoto lens, and it was really zoomed in, and I had to manually back out of the position to get a picture of this whole giraffe. And what transpired, no matter how much I backed out, was these images. And so I really had to zoom out, and I was taking one step after another while carefully focusing on this one giraffe. And this is one thing I would tell anyone who's out in the wild: never lose sight of the periphery. And we tend to do that even as brands, as companies. We forget the bigger picture when we're so kind of blinders on into one thing. But I forgot the peripheral vision, and I was just zooming in on this particular giraffe, trying to get my giraffe moment for National Geographic. And I had stumbled accidentally into another giraffe's crotch, by backing into him, surprising the Mickey out of him. He was busy eating like leaves until then. He took pause just the same moment that I took pause, both of us equally paralyzed by this utterly unfamiliar moment, and something that no wildlife wilderness survival guide prepares you for. So I'm like, what do I do now? If I run, he might kick me, and I don't know if you guys have seen giraffes kick. They can stun you to death. So I was really quite nervous as to what was going to transpire next. But in that moment, it struck me that this giraffe was working out what was going to happen next, too. And he was just as clueless as to what to do with a human being between his legs as I was. And I remember he clenched, and then he released, and I was like up in his junk. But like, you know, a really close encounter with a giraffe that I survived because he decided for some reason to walk over me and walk away. And I got like all kinds of weird pictures because of that encounter. And so I always say, you know, unique perspective is so important in communicating a story of something that has been seen so many times that we take it for granted. And if you have something that makes people see it differently or see it for the first time, that's better than the original giraffe shot that I could have gotten had I had the right lens on. And so I always tell people when I run workshops or any sort of module through which I can get people engaged through creative thinking, I ask everyone to draw the one thing that we all wake up and see or see because of. If there's no light, we couldn't see. So the sun, the most ubiquitous, most seen thing. Yet no two eyes perceive it the same way. We live in such a subjective narrative that no two eyes have drawn the exact same sun for me in any of the workshops I've ever conducted. And so I'm always acutely aware of the fact that when we look at visual stimuli, it does not come through in the exact same way to every person that is perceiving it, even if it's the exact same thing. When I walk around, I'm a lateral thinker. I just connect random dots together, and that's how I come up with what I come up with. These are just random images that show you how my process works. So one day I was walking through New York City. There was this pizza sign down by Chelsea. Dexter was trending at that point, and I was watching it. I saw a polka dot dress. Yayoi Kusama's work was up in a gallery in Chelsea. And I come back home, and I was inspired to create this image, which iterates the Japanese flag as the cove, which is where the dolphins are being slaughtered en masse, and captured for dolphinariums for display across the world. And this makes Japan not only take responsibility for what's happening, but it makes you rethink the Japanese impact on this particular trade. This was when I went diving with sharks, and I was out with a thresher. That's the most beautiful shark, so streamlined, the largest caudal fin you could ever imagine. And that made me realize that the essence of the brand of a shark is its fins. And that's what allows it to move. It's what keeps it alive. It's the spirit of the shark. And what we do through finning is take that essence away. This is when I was diving out with another mate of mine, and they were blowing air bubbles up at me. And I remember looking at my dive watch, and I thought we were running out of time just as these bubbles were dissipating. And I came up with this image, which shows an Oceania pie chart of our fisheries take around the clock. And what's wrong with the picture is that this is a cobweb of ghost lines in the ocean, and all of our seafood is now on our plate. When I go grocery shopping, I'm impossible to live with. Have been single for the longest while, finally with someone, shockingly. But when I go grocery shopping, I look at barcodes and I look at how we have turned everything into commodities. We forget that a fish comes from somewhere. It's just something that we scan when we're at checkout. And that made me come up with this particular campaign, which shows that every time we scan those lines, we're taking these massive lines into the ocean, into the wild, and snatching that which was alive yesterday and making it our meal today. So are we conscious of our supply chains, of our sourcing? This was an image I created. This is sort of the flattened graphic illustration of it, but the original image was created from plastic debris I collected from the shores of Mexico when I went out diving with whale sharks. And the image it looks like a photograph, but it's a composite of all this plastic waste, because they're filter feeders. Every time they open their mouth, they're sieving the ocean of all of this plastic. And what better way to communicate that issue than to create the shark out of the item that it's most consuming? You are what you eat, after all. This is an animation I created for American Museum of Natural History when I did a dialogue over there about the cladogram and evolution. And it basically traces life emerging on an EKG. It's the pulse of the planet. And you can see as it goes, I've kind of chopped this animation up just to show you the highlights of it. So it traces through the complexity of life, the entire biological narrative, the evolutionary narrative that's given rise to us, humans. So what we perceive in the world as external to us is where we come from. So when we throw terms like ocean acidification, when we throw terms like trophy hunting, poaching, what we're actually doing is turning back on our own lifeline, on our own narrative arc, and gunning it down, slaying it down, trimming it down. We're taking away pages of our own life book. And that's something we need to be acutely aware of. So when we are flatlining our own pulse line, we're part of that narrative. We come from life. We're not separate from it. So every time we try to think of ourselves as external to, we're not. We're within the same system that we're unraveling, and we are unraveling ourselves. It's often said that crocodiles have a brain the size of a walnut, but have managed to be around for about 200 million years. We pride ourselves in intelligence, yet we have barely managed 200,000 years, so you might have to consider how stupid we are. This is another campaign I created for WWF and Whiskers. We partnered up to look at tigers being repopulated into various wilderness areas across the world. And the commonality that they had is that most of these rural areas that had tiger populations living in buffer zones with these people, those rural people would sign their national documents as well as their land deeds with their thumb imprint. And I realized your imprint is just as unique and signifies your rights to your land as it does a tiger's stripes to a single tiger and the land it requires to exist. So it is a 1:1 ratio. Every person who stood up to give up land in their backyard was giving it up to one tiger, and they were making a difference to that tiger. And that went viral globally. And we hit about 260 million accounts, and we tied in social engagement with dollar match, with on-the-ground impact. Because we're each stakeholders in every narrative that we're participating in. I believe in people coming together. The Times Square billboard that I ran was entirely crowdfunded. I went to people to tell the story of elephants from the perspective of people who cared, and I really wanted to be a democratic experience, sorry. And what I did was illustrate this elephant with a composite of hands. And every time somebody participated and donated to the campaign, I would replace those hands and animate them with donor hands. And we saw how many people were willing to get on board and join hands. And it really became a human experience, that it was sort of a human iteration of an extant living testament to our own success and need to survive. This was another campaign I ran which had tremendous success. It was just to get people to rally against the rhino hunting that was happening in Namibia when they issued a license to one hunter. And it was a huge topic on NPR and several other forums. And what I did was run a blank image. It was just Polaroids that composited a black rhino. And I had over 2,500 submissions overnight, from photographers who are really well known, to people who had seen the rhino before I was even born, to people who had seen the last rhino of a certain kind before it was gunned down. And it was just amazing to see this narrative of the rhino come alive through so many eyes, through so many perspectives, and composite as one narrative. And what that brought alive for me was that it takes many shots to tell a single story, or just one to end it. And I always encourage people to choose a camera and not a rifle, because you're allowing for something to exist over time and have the continuity of a story as opposed to the ending of one. which also works for ecotourism because it generates more, it's 76 times more economically viable to keep an elephant alive than to shoot it down through a trophy hunting license. So even economically, it makes no sense to hunt wildlife. This was an image that I created for a campaign that I was working with a cosmetics company, and they were using a lot of plankton in their products, and they wanted to tell the story of plankton. And I wanted to tell the story of the animal, the largest animal in the world that subsists purely on plankton, which is the blue whale. And they actually are the oldest farmers in our world because their poop fertilizes their own plankton blooms, and that's what they consume. So they're the most closed-loop system you'll ever encounter. They're smarter than us in so many ways. And I decided to create this composite image of a blue whale entirely out of plankton that I'd rendered, and we used those individual plankton images as stickers and for product packaging and just a motif that we would use as a language to communicate to the public, as well as having this life-size blue whale painted. This was another image that I created to talk about the acoustic footprint of wildlife, and that the sound of silence, in fact, in nature is the most dynamic orchestra to belong to. And it is not, in fact, silence. It is this gorgeous tapestry of life that comes alive. And what we're doing is silencing it one instrument at a time. And for me, that is a really powerful way to see and experience wild, is sensorially. Because we are thinking, feeling creatures, but how we internalize the world around us is through our senses. This is the campaign I'm currently working on. It started with the exhibit that I installed at National Geographic Encounter in Times Square. Each bottle that I created, that I installed, is soundscaped with a message. The messages differ. They're from different backgrounds, from different people, and they all speak to the issues that they most are passionate about. It's like a time capsule of our particular decade where we're seeing this precipice of change on the rise, whether it's about oceans or about communities or our imprint of consumer choices through plastic packaging. I have found each of the voices in these bottles have had this amazing impact, like a bait ball coming together to raise global awareness. And that gave rise to the fact that loads of schools wanted to create their own bottle installations. And so now, instead of asking people, instead of telling people, I've decided to ask people what they care most about. And this is an interesting way to have done that, because the youth, I don't know if you guys have assessed this, but every time I've gone to a conference or spoke to kids, and they've come up to ask questions during Q&A, they seem pretty jaded and disillusioned because they're mostly inheriting a completely messed up planet. And we're the ones who are voting on what they're inheriting. And they don't feel like they're an active participant in that. And I really believe in empowering them sooner than later. And so what I decided to do was create this online, it's a web app, where kids can create their own bottles and upload it. And within 365 days, the top bottles, through a leaderboard algorithm, get exhibited in Times Square. But in the meantime, what we're monitoring for is what kids are really speaking about. What do they care about cyberbullying? Do they care about the fact in Kenya that they don't have access to nutrition and therefore can't sit through the afternoon sessions of school because they're not fed enough? And some kids care about the fact that they have to walk long distance carrying water and don't have access to fresh water, don't have access to hygiene or sanitation. We're also only reaching kids who have the access and privilege to be reached. So the fact that we're not really reaching demographics outside of our immediate access zone is something that I'm looking at carefully and collaborating with multiple partners on the ground for. So it's about getting kids who are in disenfranchised backgrounds, who are in orphanages, who are in the juvenile justice system, who are not given access to creative lateral thinking, and getting them to be part of this movement and creating an egalitarian playing field where all voices are heard. If we're talking to youth, that we're talking to youth in an inclusive manner and not just to the youth that we have access to. So this is sort of just kicked off, and National Geographic Encounter is obviously a partner, so we're going to be installing the final bottles that get picked as a permanent exhibit in there. But I would end with saying this, is that individually we can tell stories, but together we change the narrative, which is why I deeply encourage partnerships, collaborations, and bringing many voices and many heads together in a singular room to come up with collaborative ideas as opposed to singular visions that somehow conquer the world and get to be the hero of the day. It's not enough. There's so much happening, and it's so complicated that if we do not actually aggregate, we do not change anything in a meaningful manner. And at the end of the day, I think the reason why I tell story after story is because each of these stories help empower or enable the one thing that I truly believe will make a significant change in whether or not humanity and nature have a future, and that's you. Thank you.